There's been a long historical debate about how the American Revolution and the emergence of the American Republic in the 1780s influenced people in France. And I want to continue this discussion by looking at several French writers who wrote about America in the decade before the French Revolution. For these pro-American writers, the new American Republic embodied much of the historical progress that they wanted to see in France. And this optimistic view of America depended on what the historian Duran Echeverria called the mirage in the West, in a classic book in which he focused on the very positive French views of America in the late 18th century. So I want to summarize some of the main issues that emerged in the French view of American progress. But I also want to show how the narrative of American progress also carried strong warnings about the regressive elements of American society. So the mirage of American progress was also haunted by the dangerous American flaws of slavery, racism, economic inequality, and consumerism. So my argument, a sort of revision of the mirage in the West interpretation, my argument emphasizes that the dream of American progress was also shadowed by the nightmare of American failure. And these contrasting themes of progressive dream and regressive nightmare, which emerged in the 1780s, have never disappeared from French narratives about America. There is a continuity from the 1780s to the later centuries. So I'm going to focus on three French writers. The first is the Marquis de Chastellux, who lived from 1734 to 1788. He went to America with the French army in 1780, and Chastellux served in the decisive Virginia campaign at Yorktown in 1781. And then he wrote a book based on his journals in America called Travels in North America, which was published in France in 1786. The second author I want to talk about is Jacquespierre Brissot. Brissot lived from 1754 to 1793, and he went to America in 1788 with the support of some bankers to explore commercial opportunities for French investments in America. And he published a book called New Travels in the United States, 1788, although the book was not actually published until 1791. And part of the book was a kind of critique of Chastellux's interpretation of America. And the third writer I want to discuss is Nikolao de Kundo, and Condorcet lived from 1743 to 1794. And during the 1780s, Condorcet wrote a number of essays about the American Revolution and the emerging American Republic. The most notable one, perhaps, was called The Influence of the American Revolution on Europe. And that was published in 1786. So all three of these writers, in some ways, exemplified this notion that America was the symbol of progress for the whole world. And they focused on four repeating themes. The first, the idea that America was the center of political progress, which meant, in their view, human freedom, human rights, and a commitment to constitutional government. The second recurring theme in these narratives about America focused on America as a center of social economic progress, where there was a kind of ongoing commercial expansion, commercial revolution, which was also connected with the concept of social equality that differed a great deal from the social hierarchies in Paris or in other parts of France. And they also noted that women, single women in America, white women, of course, single white women had more autonomy than women in France. And they also argued then a third theme, that there was cultural progress taking place in America because Americans had a higher commitment to reason, they were committed to education, and these values fostered religious tolerance and a free press. And then all of these factors, the political progress, the economic progress, the cultural progress, played out in a kind of moral progress that created better personal virtues among the common people and also shaped the behavior of America's most prominent leaders, such as Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. So there was this mirage of progress. And yet at the same time, these very same narratives began to point out the threat of regression, threats to progress that had not yet been addressed and that could swamp the progress of democracy and more egalitarian social life. And the two main themes of this regressive argument was the regressive reality of slavery and racism, and the regressive reality of unequal wealth and a rising obsession with luxury goods and consumerism. So these two factors, we'll call them slavery, racism on the one hand, and consumerism and unequal wealth on the other, these were social contradictions that threatened the progress in other areas. And these flaws limited the value of France as a model for the Europeans who were looking for a pathway to the future. So I'm going to come back to these regressive themes in a minute, but first I want to give a little more attention to the four major themes of progress that appear in all of these writings. So the first theme is political progress, by which the French writers meant a commitment to human freedom, human rights, and constitutional government. And I think Brissot set this theme up most concisely in the introductory sections of his book, New Travels in the United States, when he wrote, "You will find here the free American who now knows no boundaries but those of the universe and no constraints or prohibitive restrictions but the laws made by his own representatives." You see a sort of incredible idealization of freedom and self-government in Brissot's narrative. And this affirmation of freedom was also very important to Condorcet, who focused especially on the Declaration of Independence and on the declarations of rights that emerged in various American states in the period of the 1770s and 1780s. Condorcet said that the American Declaration of Independence was, quote, the most sublime exposition of rights that had ever been stated in the modern world, rights that had been forgotten in Europe. But these rights were not simply enshrined in documents or in abstract categories of political theory. They were actually being promoted in the institutions of the governments of the various states and of the national government. And this was the point Chastellux made in his book when he said, "In America, we find a government in which the people express their will through their delegates." So this was the political theme. At the same time, however, there was a great emphasis on the social and economic aspects of this progress, which were linked to the political progress. And it was believed that without a flourishing economy, the political system would not survive. And Brissot made this point repeatedly in his accounts of cities like Boston or New York or Philadelphia. And in one of his accounts of New York, he wrote, "Let those who doubt the prodigious effects of liberty on man and on his industry come to America. What miracles they will witness." This was something that comes up again and again in Brissot and in Chastellux and in others. The American economic progress is the foundation for other forms of progress. And both Brissot and Chastellux were fascinated by what they took to be the social equality of human interactions in American cities and in the countryside. Chastellux described going to a rural area where he saw people gathered around. They had been working to build some houses in a community. And he said, and when they were done, they worked hard and their recompense was simply, quote, "a cask of cider drunk in common and with gaiety, or a gallon of rum." That's all they asked, just a sense of community. And this was very important to Chastellux and Brissot as an example of how social equality could evolve in America. And they saw it also as related to the role of women. And both Brissot and Chastellux said women are much freer in America than they are in France. As Chastellux wrote in his travels in North America, an extreme liberty prevails in this country between the two sexes as long as they are not married. Married women had less freedom. So this was the great achievement of social equality. But there was also cultural progress. And this cultural progress depended on the economy and the politics. Above all, it was a land, according to people like Condorcet, where there was an expansion of the use of reason in everyday life. And although Condorcet never visited an American school or an American university, he wrote in The Influence of the American Revolution, "There is reason to hope that a few generations from now, America, by producing almost as many men who will be busy adding to the extent of our knowledge as all of Europe, will at least double its progress or make it twice as fast." And so the visitors who came to America, like Chastellux, they made a point of showing that the schools and the universities in America were as strong as the universities in Europe. And Chastellux went, for example, to Harvard and to William and Mary and to Princeton, and he claimed that the professors there were every bit as talented as the professors in France or in Europe. And this education, in turn, was encouraging religious tolerance. He had, Chastellux, a very idealistic view of tolerance in America. He said, America is the only country possessing true tolerance, that absolute tolerance, which has triumphed over superstition. I think many people would have doubted that in the 1780s, and many would surely doubt it today, but there is the idealistic view of cultural progress. And it was related to the emergence of a free press, because Condorcet said the press is freer in America than in Europe. And he said, Condorcet, Americans are governed more than any other people by reason alone. But this cultural progress contributed, along with the economic progress and the political progress, to a new kind of personal virtue, which these visitors found in the idealized view of daily life in America. As Brissot said, the habitual practice of reason produces in America a large number of what are called principled men. And Brissot particularly celebrated the simplicity and integrity of the Quakers in Pennsylvania, for example, but also other farmers and merchants who he said were unpretentious, who dressed simply, who did not try to put on airs in any way. And Chastellux also was very impressed by those characteristics. But the writers also stressed the achievements of the most prominent American leaders. That is, people like Benjamin Franklin. Condorcet knew Franklin in Paris, and when Franklin died in 1790, Condorcet presented an eulogy for Franklin, in which he described him as a kind of ideal type philosopher citizen who showed how to merge philosophy, a simple lifestyle, and the values of constitutionalism and human freedom. He was the ideal type human being. And the same was said of George Washington. Chastellux went to visit Washington, and he said he was a man of simplicity, of integrity, and very different from the kind of commanders you saw in the French army. And Brissot also met Washington. And he said of Washington, his modesty is astonishing, particularly to a Frenchman. And Brissot celebrated Washington's modesty, simplicity, and sort of down-to-earth characteristics. At the same time, however, he criticized Washington's slaveholding. He visited Washington at Mount Vernon, and he began to critique Washington for being a slaveholder. He said, quote, "It would undoubtedly be fitting that such a lofty, pure, and disinterested soul as George Washington would be the one to make the first step in the abolition of slavery in Virginia. But unfortunately, Washington was not willing to do that. He would not take that first step. And this leads then to the counter narrative, the narrative of the regressive realities of slavery and racism. As Condorcet said, this was the great flaw of American society. Condorcet described what he called the contradictions and hypocrisy of the American denial of human rights to enslaved people. And he stressed, quote, all enlightened men feel the shame as well as the danger of slavery. How can these Americans who advocate for freedom practice this institutional racism of slavery? And Chastellux also condemned the slave system. He was in Virginia during the campaign of 1781, and he also criticized the way slavery worked. But when the governor of Virginia said to Chastellux, are your troops hiding enslaved people who have run away? Chastellux said, no, we will not do that. We will not protect these runaway enslaved people. And so in a way, at the very moment that the Americans were winning their freedom in Virginia, they were also reasserting their imprisonment, their enslavement of Black people. And Chastellux, although he condemned it, was not able to overcome that. Brissot was also a staunch critic of slavery. He was one of the founding members of the French Society of the Friends of Blacks, which called for the abolition of slavery throughout the Atlantic world. But Brissot even went beyond most abolitionists in condemning the racism of American society. And he said that wherever you went, north or south, white people were pervasively racist. He said this is one of his explanations after he saw white people mocking a young Black child. White Americans express a contempt in which Negroes are still held, a contempt which Americans above all others must renounce if they wish to be consistent. Racial discrimination is apparent everywhere, north and south. And he also challenged the argument that he heard in every state, oh, the Black families are inferior in their ability to solve problems or to get an education. And he went to a school in Philadelphia for free Black children, and he wrote there, the Black students in Philadelphia, by their virtue and diligence, disprove the slanderous lies which their oppressors utter about them elsewhere. So slavery was the regressive flaw at the heart of the new American Republic. And the other central regressive problem was a growing inequality of wealth. As Chastellux explained, wherever you went, there were more and more people getting rich, but there was even a greater number of people who were not getting rich. And there was going to be a gap between the rich and the poor, which would overturn the theoretical equality of politics. As Chastellux wrote, success of trade and even of agriculture will introduce riches among you, Americans, and riches will produce inequality of fortunes and property. And now wherever this inequality exists, the real force will invariably be on the side of property. There will always be a contradiction, a struggle between the form of government, democratic, and its natural tendency, the accumulation of power in the hands of property. The right will be on one side and the power on the other. This was the fundamental contradiction of concentrated wealth that Americans had not solved. And Brissot also worried about this, especially because he saw how people were turning to luxury goods, to consumerism, and he believed this would undermine the democratic system. As he wrote in a kind of warning, a kind of moralistic warning to the American people, you who aspire to independence then renounce luxury. Inspire in your children an aversion to it. Teach them to love simplicity and orderliness in all their doings and all their occupations. And so what he was basically saying was that the contradiction could overturn the democratic goals. So, to conclude, America, by 1790, began to lose its role as the symbol of progress in the Western world. The French Revolution transformed Europe and became the symbol of progress. The main pro-American writers all died. Chastellux died in 1788, even before the revolution began. And ironically, both Brissot and Condorcet, advocates of the revolution, became two of the most prominent victims of the most radical phase of the French Revolution. And yet the themes of their narrative did not disappear. The United States continued to be described as the homeland of freedom, human rights, and constitutional government in American narratives, the American narratives of exceptionalism, which constructed a new image of America as the hope of the world. But now this was the narrative told by American narrators. America was also seen as the land of progress, as the place where human economic activity was expanding, where there was new cultural freedom, where there was religious tolerance and intellectual freedom, and where a kind of superior egalitarianism shaped American values. And yet, these positive, progressive images of America were always countered by the counter-narrative of American regression, the narrative that French writers developed even as they praised America as the land of progress. Their narratives were never as naive or as optimistic as some have assumed, because they always saw the fundamental contradictions. So they always pointed out the flaws of racism and the contradiction of slavery. And from the very beginning of the American Republic, even the most sympathetic French observers noted the danger of concentrated wealth and obsessive consumerism, which could distract the system away from its democratic principles and give extra power to the wealthy. And therefore, America in its post-colonial age could lapse toward the age-old history of human miseries and disappointment. And this early French narrative, which conveyed both deep fears and progressive aspirations, this narrative has never disappeared. And the complex contradictions of American society that French writers began to describe in the 1780s remain at the center of the narratives about America among France's even most sympathetic pro-American writers today. And the contradiction is represented here by the image of Thomas Jefferson and the signers of the Declaration of Independence on the one hand, and the people of South Carolina, the Gullah workers who were enslaved. And here's an image from 1790, a contradiction that was never resolved in the 1790s, and a contradiction that continues to haunt America into the 21st century. That is the progress and regression story of American history. Thank you.